There's a quiet lie that slows more people down than failure ever could. It's the lie that progress comes from intensity. That if you could just feel more motivated, more inspired, more fired up, then everything would finally start moving. But what most people don't realize is that intensity is not what produces speed. Consistency does. And consistency is not powered by emotion, it's powered by repetition. This is where so many goals quietly stall out, not because the goal is wrong, not because the person lacks discipline. Have you heard that right? If only you would have more discipline, but because they keep waiting for the emotional moment that makes the work feel easier. And that moment, it rarely arrives. The brain does not move faster because you're excited. The brain moves faster because it has seen the same action enough times that it stops resisting it. And that's the real secret behind divine acceleration. Hi, if you're new to me, my name is Raquel, and I'm your GPS for success. Let's get started. Repetition. Neuroscience actually explains this beautifully. Your brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. Every time you do something new, your brain has to burn additional glucose and oxygen to figure it out. It has to analyze, it has to calculate, and decide. But when an action is repeated over and over again, something powerful begins to happen. The brain starts building what are called the neural pathways. And these pathways, they allow signals to travel faster because the brain has already mapped the road. So over time, those pathways become coded in a substance called myelin. And this is something that strengthens the connection and allows the signal to fire with less effort. So what once felt difficult begins to feel automatic. And this is why something like driving a car feels overwhelming the first time you do it, but effortless, right? Years later. Nothing about the car changed. Your brain simply built the pathway. And this is also why repetition is the real engine behind transformation. Speed is not created by forcing yourself harder. Speed is created when the brain no longer has to negotiate the action. Now, here's where this becomes even more powerful when we look at it through a biblical lens. Scripture never describes transformation as a one time emotional event, it describes transformation as a process of renewal. In the book of Romans, it says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And that word, renewing, implies repetition. It implies returning to the same truth again and again until the mind begins to align with it. This is exactly how neural pathways are formed. Truth repeated becomes belief. Belief repeated becomes identity. Identity repeated becomes behavior. And behavior repeated becomes results. You can begin to see why repetition collapses timelines. Because every time you repeat the right action, you are removing friction from the next one. The first time, well, it's hard, yeah. But the second time, it becomes easier. The third time, it becomes more familiar. At least it feels that way. And somewhere along the line, something subtle shifts. The action stops feeling like something you have to force. It begins to feel like something you simply just do. But there is another layer here that people often miss, the emotional layer. Many people assume repetition will only work if they feel good doing it. But the nervous system actually learns through exposure, not emotion. If an action feels uncomfortable at first, whether that's writing, exercising, launching a project, or even having a difficult conversation, the brain is going to interpret that discomfort as a potential threat. And that's when hesitation shows up. That's when procrastination whispers. But when you repeat the action anyway, something fascinating happens inside the nervous system. The brain begins to downgrade the perceived threat. It starts to realize this didn't harm us. And slowly the resistance fades. And once that felt stressful thing that you were doing or trying to ignore, not to, that becomes neutral. What once felt scary becomes manageable. And eventually it becomes normal. This is why repetition doesn't just build skill, it builds emotional safety. The brain begins to trust the action. And once the brain trusts the action, it stops slowing you down. This is one of the quiet miracles of consistent effort. And you are not just producing output, you are retraining your brain. You are teaching your nervous system that forward movement is safe. And over time, that creates something incredibly powerful: momentum. Momentum is not created by giant leaps, it's created by small actions repeated often enough that resistance no longer has time to rebuild itself. This is why people who seem to move quickly are rarely doing something dramatic. They're simply repeating the right action long enough for the path to become clear. They are no longer negotiating with themselves every day. They are simply walking the road they have already decided to travel. And once that happens, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Progress stops feeling fragile, it starts to feel inevitable. There is a reason repetition is so powerful. It removes the negotiation. Most people don't realize how much time is lost in the internal debate that happens before an action even begins. You've heard this, or you've probably said it yourself, right? I'll start tomorrow, or like the famous, I'll start on Monday. I just need the right mood. Maybe later when things calm down. Yeah, guilty. Every one of those small negotiations, it stretches the timeline. Not because the work itself takes long, but because the starting point keeps on getting delayed. It's like this goalpost that keeps on, right, moving. And this is why repetition is not just a productivity tool, it's a decision stabilizer. When something is repeated daily, the mind slowly stops asking the question, should I do this today? The question disappears. It simply becomes, this is what I do. And the moment that shift happens, time begins to compress because now energy is no longer being spent deciding, it is being spent executing. This is where one of the most practical tools in this entire season becomes incredibly valuable. It's the 20-minute rule. 20 minutes may not sound impressive, but the power of it is not in the length. The power is in the repeatability. When a task feels overwhelming, the brain immediately begins to look for escape routes, right? You've noticed that. It anticipates exhaustion, frustration, or failure. But when the commitment is small and defined, this is what's interesting. The brain relaxes. 20 minutes, it feels manageable. It feels survivable. And because it feels manageable, it becomes far easier to repeat tomorrow and the next day and the next. And over time, those small windows of effort begin stacking in ways that are almost invisible at first. But then suddenly, something remarkable appears: progress. Not dramatic progress, not overnight success, but undeniable movement. This is the kind of progress that quietly compounds. A page written each day becomes a finished manuscript. 20 minutes of movement becomes a healthier body. Consistent outreach becomes a thriving business. Small repetitions begin building large outcomes. And here's a deeper truth: the brain loves visible progress. When the brain sees movement, It's going to release dopamine. Yes, that neurotransmitter connected to motivation and reward. This is why repetition eventually becomes easier because the brain begins to associate the action with forward movement. And forward movement, it feels good. But repetition also serves another purpose that is deeply connected to spiritual growth. It builds faith through evidence. In scripture, we see this pattern over and over again. Faith is not just belief, faith grows through remembrance. Throughout the Bible, God repeatedly tells his people to remember what he has already done. Remember the miracles, remember the provision, remember the victories. Why? Because remembrance reinforces belief, and belief reinforces action. This is not just spiritual encouragement, it's a neurological reinforcement. Every time you revisit the truth, every time you repeat a practice aligned with that truth, you strengthen the pathway that supports it. You are quite literally renewing the mind. You are building the internal environment where faith becomes the natural response rather than doubt. This is why repetition is not boring, it is formative, it's shaping who you are becoming. And here is something important to understand. Most people underestimate the power of repetition because the early stages feel uneventful. The first few days rarely look impressive. The first few weeks may feel slow, but beneath the surface, something profound is happening. The brain is wiring, the nervous system is adapting, your identity is shifting. And once that shift happens, the results begin to accelerate because now the action is no longer external effort, it's internal alignment. You are no longer forcing behavior, you are expressing identity. This is where inevitability begins. Inevitability is not created by bursts of inspiration, it is created by rhythm, daily rhythm, consistent rhythm, faithful rhythm. This is why the people who eventually achieve extraordinary things are often doing very ordinary actions. They are writing when no one is watching, they're practicing when the room is quiet, they're showing up when the results have not yet appeared. They are repeating, and each repetition is another vote for the future they are building. Eventually, those votes accumulate. Eventually, the identity solidifies. Eventually, the results begin to mirror the rhythm. And what once felt slow suddenly feels like acceleration because repetition has quietly removed the friction that used to slow everything down. Now, after this short break, we're going to explore how repetition becomes the bridge between intention and what will eventually happen, and why the smallest daily actions often produce the fastest transformations. I'll see you on the other side. Prospero TV provides a platform for independent voices, professionals, and thought leaders to share their insights, experiences, and perspectives. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Prospero TV Network, Show Your Crown Enterprises, or its affiliates. Content shared within this program is intended for informational, educational, and inspirational purposes. While some hosts and guests may be professionals or subject matter experts, the information presented is general in nature and should not replace personalized advice from qualified professionals regarding your individual circumstances. By viewing this program, you acknowledge that any decisions or actions taken based on the content are your own responsibility.
This is the day I remember who I am. No fear, no doubt. I carry heaven in my live, in my move. Every breath is proof. I'm not bound to what I see. Spirit over everything. Born from above, I know my source. Royal blood in my course. I don't shrink, I don't cower. faith and love. What do you do? Speak and decree. What happens then? Heaven agrees. No fear in me, no doubt in me. His power lives inside of me. I know who I am. I know who I am. I know who I
Welcome back. When most people hear the word repetition, they imagine boredom. They picture the same action repeated again and again with little excitement. And I know I'm one of those because I'm a hyper creative. Because it sounds slow, right? It sounds tedious. It sounds like unfun. It's not fun. It sounds like the opposite of acceleration. But in reality, repetition is the very thing that produces speed because repetition removes friction. Earlier, we talked about how the brain builds neural pathways when something is practiced repeatedly. But there's another layer of neuroscience happening at the same time that most people don't realize. Your brain has a network called the basal ganglia, right? This is the part of the brain responsible for habit formation. It's where repeated actions eventually move when the brain decides we don't need to think about this anymore. When an action first begins, it's going to live right in the prefrontal cortex, the decision making center of the brain. And this is the area responsible for planning, for reasoning, and evaluating, right? It's like your strategist. But the prefrontal cortex tires easily. That's why decision fatigue is real. The more decisions you make throughout the day, the more depleted that part of the brain becomes. But repetition solves that problem. Because when an action is repeated enough times, the brain transfers it out of the decision center and into the habit center. And once that transfer happens, the action becomes dramatically easier. And this is why brushing your teeth doesn't require motivation, right? This is why tying your shoes doesn't require emotional readiness. These actions, they're just automated. Your brain has already decided they belong in the rhythm of your life. Now, imagine if the actions connected to your goals lived in that same system. Imagine if writing, exercising, learning, praying, building, creating, or serving others no longer required a daily debate. Imagine if they simply lived in your rhythm. That's what repetition eventually produces. But there's another powerful layer here that connects deeply with scripture. God designed the human soul around rhythm. When you look through the Bible, you begin to see repetition everywhere: daily bread, daily prayer, daily renewal. Even creation itself is described in rhythm: evening and morning, day after day. The spiritual life was never designed to operate on occasional bursts of inspiration. It was designed to operate on faithful repetition. Jesus himself modeled this rhythm. The Gospels repeatedly show him withdrawing to quiet places to pray, not once, not occasionally, but consistently. Why? Because repetition anchors alignment. It brings the mind, the heart, and the spirit back into the same direction. And when alignment exists, acceleration becomes possible. The same thing happens in your nervous system. When actions are repeated daily, your nervous system begins to anticipate them. It begins to prepare for them. And this reduces stress. It reduces hesitation. It reduces internal resistance. The body begins to move with the action instead of pushing against it. And this Is why rhythm is so powerful for emotional regulation. When the nervous system knows what to expect, it relaxes. Uncertainty creates stress. Predictability creates safety. Repetition builds predictability, and predictability creates the emotional stability required for long term progress. This is also why people who rely purely on motivation, they struggle to maintain momentum. Motivation is emotional, rhythm is neurological. Motivation comes and goes, but rhythm stays. And when the rhythm stays, progress compounds. There is another important truth here. Repetition also trains the mind to trust the process. At the beginning of any journey, the results are rarely visible. That's the part that tests people. You're showing up, you're doing the work, but the external evidence hasn't caught up yet. That's when doubt tries to sneak in. That's when people start asking, is this even working? But repetition strengthens something deeper than immediate results. It strengthens trust. Every day you repeat the action, you are reinforcing a simple message inside your brain. I am someone who follows through. And that message becomes identity. Identity is what sustains behavior long after motivation fades. This is why scripture speaks so often about perseverance. In the book of Galatians, it says, let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Notice the language. Do not grow weary. Continue doing good. A harvest will come. This is the rhythm of repetition. Seeds are planted daily. Growth happens quietly beneath the surface, and eventually the harvest appears. But harvest never shows up on the first day. It shows up for those who continue showing up. Repetition builds that kind of life. Not dramatic, not flashy, but steady. And steady is what creates acceleration. Because when the right actions are repeated consistently, resistance no longer has room to grow back. Momentum takes over. And once momentum begins to move, progress starts happening faster than it did ever before. Momentum is one of the most misunderstood forces in personal growth. People often assume momentum appears after results, but the truth is, momentum appears before the results ever show up. Momentum is born the moment repetition becomes your rhythm. And this is why repetition eventually creates something that feels almost supernatural. Things start moving faster, not because you suddenly worked harder, but because resistance has finally lost its grip. When the brain stops negotiating, when the nervous system stops bracing, when the decision has already been made, execution becomes lighter, and lighter execution creates speed. Think about the difference between pushing a car that is completely still and pushing a car that is already rolling. At first, the effort is enormous. The car barely moves. You push and push and push just to get the wheels turning. But once it starts rolling, something shifts. Now, the same effort, it produces far more movement. That is momentum. Repetition is what gets the wheels turning. And once they are turning, progress begins to multiply. This is why the people who appear to be moving the fastest, like me, are often the ones doing the simplest things repeatedly. And actually, when we're recording this, it's in 2026. And in 2025, that was the word that God gave me for the year was simplicity. And 2025 ended up being a year of speed because I had to keep on coming back to that word, keeping things simple. Because what simplicity does is that it reveals how well you know something. Can you explain it simply? Can you give it away to somebody else to do it for you simply? Can you hand it off, right? Is it something that you can repeatedly do? And now, in less than a year of doing some things, TV show, music, record label, publishing art with anthologies, radio station, magazine, all from last year in May 2025. And when I'm recording this, it's March 2026. Keeping things simple. That is my secret sauce, right? So other people, they write every day, they create every day, they move their body every day, they build relationships every day. They're not chasing motivation, they're living in rhythm. And rhythm produces, right, that inevitable outcome. Eventually, the results begin to mirror the repetition. The harvest begins to reflect the planting. But there is also a deeper spiritual principle at work here. Scripture repeatedly describes faith as something that grows through practice. Faith is not a feeling you wait for, faith is something you walk in. The book of James says that faith without works is dead. In other words, belief becomes alive when it is expressed through action. And when those actions are repeated consistently, faith itself becomes stronger. You begin to see small confirmations. You begin to notice progress. You begin to recognize that the work you're doing is not wasted. Each repetition becomes another seed, another moment of alignment, another quiet vote for the future God placed inside your heart. And over time, something powerful begins to take shape. Not just progress, identity. You become the kind of person who follows through. You become the kind of person who moves forward daily. You become the kind of person who finishes what they start. That identity is what collapses timelines. Because once identity is established, behavior stops requiring force. It becomes expression. And expression moves far faster than effort ever could. This is why the divine acceleration blueprint is not about pushing harder. It's about removing the friction that slows people down. And repetition is one of the most powerful tools for doing exactly that. Small daily actions, repeated consistently, long enough for resistance to fade and momentum to take over. If this idea resonates with you, the idea of building momentum through small, consistent execution, that's exactly what the Task Animal system was designed to help you with. Task Animal helps you take the big goals that often feel overwhelming and break them into simple daily movements that your brain can repeat. Because when the brain can repeat something, it can automate it. And when it automates it, progress accelerates. If you'd like to explore that system and see how it works, you can learn more at taskanimal.net. Now, next week, we're going to explore something that becomes incredibly important once momentum starts building. Because moving faster is exciting, but speed then introduces a new challenge. What happens when things actually start working? What happens when opportunities increase, when growth happens, it starts to appear, and when life begins to expand faster than expected? So, next week, we're going to talk about capacity before speed, why some people burn out the moment success begins, how emotional, mental, and spiritual capacity determine how much growth you can actually hold, and how to expand your life without collapsing under the weight of it. Because acceleration isn't just about moving faster, it's about becoming the kind of person who can sustain the life that you're building. Until next time, may God's richest and best be yours. Bye for now.
This is your Prospera era, where dreams align with grace, abundance flows like rivers. You've stepped into your place. Rise, reign, and remember, you were born to shine. Welcome to your moment, Prospera, it's time.
We hope you enjoyed today's show on Prospera TV Network. Make it a point to visit us on YouTube and catch all your favorite shows anytime you want. Interested in hosting a show of your own? Or advertising your business on our network? Contact Elena Rodriguez.